Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Teresa Terza. I'm Head of Marketing at Synalytics, and I will be the moderator for this session. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, the session will be recorded, and we will, of course, share the recording with you afterwards. Please feel also free to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature. You can also send them in anonymously if you prefer that, and we will then address as many as possible during the Q&A at the end of the presentations. Let me introduce you to the speakers and agenda for today's session. First of all, Björn Konrad, CEO of Synalytics, will start us off with a few introductory words. Then it's time for today's briefing experts to take the stage. Martin Catarata is providing us with an overview and geopolitical outlook. Then Jost Wübbeke will analyze the current landscape of export controls and their practical implementation. We will also have a look at the future risks and strategies. We will reserve the last roundabout 20 minutes of the webinar for your questions. And with that said, I would like to hand it over to you, Björn.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks to all of you for coming. As always, very happy that you found your way to us today, and with obviously, as always, exciting, very timely and important discussion. Weaponization of economic instruments to achieve geopolitical goals is, I think, one of the defining characteristics of our time. And by now, definitely everyone here in the room right now is very keenly, it's very painfully aware that Chinese export controls are definitely one of the sharpest weapons in this fight. So that big picture realization that this is going on, that's a good starting point, but does not really help companies to make hands-on pragmatic actual changes that help you to mitigate disruption, right? Because coming up with operational level solutions requires good understanding of the operational level of the problem. So which exact export control instruments are in play here, for which exact critical materials, for which technologies, how are they being used, how are they being implemented, what are all these nuances that help you to find smart ways to mitigate, right? So to give us at least an initial glimpse of what that kind of operational in-depth understanding looks like, there could be no one better than Martin and Jost. They have worked on these topics long before anyone worried about tungsten and dysprosium. So with that, I'm not going to steal any more of their time and hand over to Martin to give us some of the insights. Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Björn. Thanks, Teresa. So just to quickly reiterate, we divided the presentation today into two parts. I will be looking at the big picture, what can we make of the current US-China relations and the Chinese export controls, and what is the outlook. And then Jost will continue with a closer look into the Chinese export controls, the implications for companies, and how we could also see them continuing. Then, of course, we will also go into Q&A and happy to take all of your questions of everything that we couldn't address during the presentation. So starting with the big picture, I have the small task of basically setting the geopolitical context of the US-China conflict and specifically the Chinese export controls for today. So I thought how best to start with this and seeing that everyone in this group probably is already very deep into the topic since it's been so long already that we have been in this whole US-China trade war and even the trade war during the first administration. I don't think that we need to rehash how exactly we got here. So instead, I think it makes sense to focus for my part on two specific questions. The first one is, how can we read the current status of the US-China bilateral relationship given the recent agreement between President Trump and President Xi? And then secondly, how do we think the agreement will play out in the coming months? So to start with the first question and to give a short answer to a complicated question, I think we see that there's a genuine commitment by both sides to make this agreement last, especially on the Chinese side. the fast rollout of all of the measures that address the agreement between President Xi and President Trump is in quite sharp contrast to the slow implementation of measures that we have seen during the first deal between China and the US during the first Trump administration. So you can see here on the right side all of the announcements that have been made by MOFCOM, China Customs, China's Ministry of Transport, in order to address everything that had been put on the table between the US and China, from export controls, halting the export controls from October 9, suspending the export bans on gallium, germanium, and super hard materials to the US that had been in place since, I think, May, if I'm not mistaken, to the port fees, sanctions. Nexperia has already been addressed. The flow has already started in terms of the export. Some of the investigations that China had started on anti-dumping duties on US optical fiber, for example, have already been repealed. There are some others that are still open, but I think this is already a start. Agricultural purchases, a very important political issue for the US, has also been addressed. Customs has restored soybean export qualifications to 3 US companies, and we have already seen the first purchases of US soybeans. And then lastly, on fentanyl, MOFCOM has also applied new export controls on 13 precursor chemicals. So that's also an additional step from the Chinese side to address the fentanyl issue put up by the US. So to reiterate, I think the fast speed of implementation here really is a good sign that this agreement might prove a little bit more durable than the results from the previous talks between the US and China. But of course, these agreements are just a temporary suspension. So especially the extraterritorial expansion of the Chinese export controls, basically the Chinese version of the US foreign direct product rule, this has been a major driver of the agreement. This is only suspended for 1 year. So this is the agreement is mostly a ceasefire that buys both sides time to either hash out the more structural and fundamental issues in the bilateral relation, which I think is probably a little bit too much to ask for, or B, become independent enough from the other side to be able to also endure the pain inflicted by the other sides, for example, through export controls or the tariffs. Of course, despite the agreement, there is also still very much real concrete points that remain. So China has not rescinded the entire export control regime that it had built up. It has only repealed everything that had been put up after October 9. There are also still some investigations into the US semiconductor industry that are currently still ongoing in the US. In China, and on the US side, obviously export controls have also not been really reduced. So there are still a lot of points of tensions that could also see some form of escalation over the next couple of months, even though we don't think that it will escalate beyond a certain red line. However, I think what is the most immediate risk for derailing the agreement is the main stumbling block ahead is the implementation of the general export licenses that the Chinese side has promised. I think this will how successful the implementation of these general export licenses will really determine whether or not this agreement between China and the US can hold. And then there are a couple of issues that could hinder or hold the implementation on the Chinese side. So first, the licensing process is very likely to be very complex and highly invasive for companies. Companies will have to lay bare much of its supply chain in order to gain those licenses. That could be problematic not only for the companies themselves, but of course also for the governments that might not want to see their companies to reveal too much of their supply chains, to not give China extra targeted pain points that China could leverage in the geopolitical environment. The second issue that we see that could derail the general licenses for the export of raw materials is China's administrative capacity within the Ministry of Commerce. even though we have seen a hiring spree on the side of MOFCOM, as you can see here on the right side, and also an increase in the number of people working on economic security related measures, especially also on export controls, there is still a significant bottleneck also on the side of MOFCOM that could still significantly delay or derail the implementation of the general export licenses. So we have seen that already with the previous EU-China special channel for export licenses agreed a couple of months earlier for the old set of export controls. What we have seen here is that only around 50% of the 2,000 EU applications have been cleared by MOFCOM since April. So certainly now we will see an even higher application volume that could significantly be a bottleneck. That could be a significant bottleneck for MOFCOM. I think another issue that has not really been discussed so much in the media is the Chinese sanctions regime, which remains also quite elevated despite recent rollbacks. So I think the sanctions regime, even though it is currently mostly targeted against the US defense industry, we have seen some expansions of it also, for example, against some Korean companies that have now been rolled back. But still, I think going forward, there is not really a framework agreement between the US and China on how to address these sanctions. And I think this could also, going forward, be a stumbling block that could see or that could lead to a rise in tensions between China and the US again. Lastly, to give a little bit of an outlook of where we think things are going from here, and Björn, you and I have recently written about the escalation spirals in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. So I will just basically repeat the arguments that we have made there to make the argument for where we think the outlook for US-China relations, or where the truce agreement will go from here. So I think on a fundamental level, both sides, both the US and China, see the conflict as somewhat as inevitable. Both sides are preparing for a long-term confrontation by reducing key dependencies. Of course, the Chinese side has been preparing for this for quite some time. The US is also now kicking into high gear to reduce vulnerabilities on raw materials. So I think both sides in the long term expect that the conflict will drag on and are preparing to reduce vulnerabilities. For now, however, both sides are not really ready for the escalation. So even though we always see escalation spikes over the last recent months, both sides, whenever it got really critical, have never crossed the red lines that both sides have put into the sand due to the mutual dependencies on the other side. So Chinese relying on US technology and the US relying on Chinese raw materials. So even though in the future we still might see some periodic cycles of escalation going forward, we think that the tentative truce will at least hold for the time being without spiraling into an excessive escalation. Even though we still see currently there are a lot of decoupling tools in preparation. So we know that the US is preparing more ICTS regulations that could see market access restrictions for Chinese companies, for example. And also on the Chinese side, we see, for example, that China has now forbidden Chinese hyperscalers officially to use NVIDIA chips in their data centers. I think that is a step towards one of their steps towards more technological self-sufficiency. So definitely there are still friction points in preparation right now that could see spikes in tensions. But again, to reiterate, I think overall both sides are not ready yet for an escalation. So we will see the tentative truce hold for the time being. Just to give it also a little bit of an outlook, because I mentioned the US preparations to truces for raw materials. We looked a little bit into all of the projects on the US side to put up or to diversify their raw material sources. As you can see, There's a lot of efforts on the US domestic side, here on the left side, through the DOC, DOE, and DOD. Especially the DOD invested at least 2.3 billion US dollar into 48 projects to build up domestic capacities for raw material refining or recycling, or even research in certain aspects. And then on the right side, you see all of the international collaborations that the US has been spearheading. Most recently, of course, with Japan and Australia, but also with other partners to diversify their sources. So with that, I will hand over to Jost for a more detailed view on the Chinese export controls.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Martin. And yeah, as Martin said, I will go a little bit more in detail into the export controls. So let's switch to the next slide. So I think this is a chart which we very regularly update, like which items are actually on the list of export controls. And as you see, obviously, this is a thing that has been going on since mid 2023. So yeah, it has been emerging continuously. And then, of course, we had the big shock in April 2025, but there was a lot of things going on. And then on top of that, on October 9th, we would have this additional increase, which you see here on the very right side, but that is, of course, now temporary. I think one important thing to understand is it is not always all of the materials that are being controlled. Yeah, so for example, for molybdenum, we have, I think, only 1 or 2 HDS codes, HS codes. And I think that shows also you have to be very specific to see what is impacted and what not. Another issue I think that might also be worth mentioning, it's not just these, ad hoc controls that are of relevance, but there's actually also a dual use item control list on the Chinese side where much more materials are mentioned. So obviously not just raw materials, but for example, zirconium targets and many other products. And I think that is also something to look at. So if you look at the next slide, so what you have just seen in the format of a bar chart, you see here again as a table with all the regulations that have come up since 2020. So we are excluding here administrative regulations, which just control the process, but we would also, here we have only the regulations that actually regulate the actual export of certain materials. And obviously, gallium, germanium, graphite, antimony. We have also super hard materials, tungsten, and so on. And yeah, the round then and this was until April. So also dysprosium is well known, and terbium and the magnets, of course. And I think what's interesting, as I said, these dual use export control catalogs, which the most recent one is 2025. So usually these are coming up at the end of the year. It's not always happening every year. So for example, there was none for the year 2022 or no update. But with these changes, I think we could expect another catalog also for 2026. And normally these are released at the end of the year. So maybe so during Christmas time when nobody watches in the Western Hemisphere, I think there could be a new catalog coming up. But again, this is not clear, but there's a certain possibility. Wouldn't expect too much changes in that catalog since it's also just updates the changes that have also been going on, but maybe in some details you might still find some nuances or some changes. Yeah, so that's everything before April. And then on the next slide, you see everything that's happened after April. I think I wouldn't go here. These are basically the October 9th export controls, and I wouldn't spend so much time on this now. I think since they are also well known and postponed now by 1 year. So probably we will talk about this slide again in about 1 year. But I think maybe I would just give some comments on what actually surprised me, or what didn't surprise me. I think what didn't surprise me is that these controls came. Yeah? So I think after April, it was clear there would be more heavy rare earths being controlled. We actually also always said, watch out for cathode active materials and anode materials, because there's an obvious bottleneck. And I think for China, it's much harder to control lithium or cobalt compared where it doesn't have like a geological advantage, but actually for for these intermediary products. What did surprise me though was how much at once. Yeah, so this was 6 regulations at once, and to me it really seems like where China was trying to gain also a little bit of be proactive in the tensions in the competition with the US, also put pressure on the US and not just retaliate, which has done before. However, I think on the other hand, you see it also how strongly China felt being attacked by the 50% rule in terms of the US entity list. Yeah, so I think that is not to be underestimated. And I think with various cases, also including Xperia, of course, we also saw that this was quite impactful. What I also found interesting, then, like Trump said, oh yeah, rare earths coming again and 100% and so on. But he didn't actually mention all the things that were happening in the battery supply chain. And I think if these things would have been implemented in the separate battery supply chain, I think we would have like major impact on another front, not just for the magnet, not just for the motors and generators and so on, but also for batteries, since many of foreign cell makers still rely on Chinese cathode material, anode material, and precursors. All postponed by 1 year. I think that's fine, as Martin said. And I think one thing is, of course, also this extraterritorial part, which would have been massive, yeah, because many companies that wouldn't have to get licenses before would have to get it. And this would include also semi-finished products that use actually Chinese rare earths or magnets. And I think that is quite enormous. And I think from what we heard, I think China is also quite relieved that they don't have to give all those licenses or to go through this process. Okay, so on the next slide, and I think this is an important thing to distinguish, and also maybe also something to watch out for the next few months. So the orange part here, that is actually where China agreed to postpone the current regulations. And you see these are these 6 regulations on super hard materials, by the way, which are super important also for the semiconductor and automotive industries, like these diamond saws, for example, for the cutting wafers and so on. So that is a good thing. Yeah, also like on the battery thing, on the highly dense lithium batteries. And China has already implemented this. Yeah, and after we actually had this Trump meeting, I always said like I'm only gonna believe it when MOFCOM makes an announcement and saying like, okay, these things are postponed. And that came out on Friday last week. And it was a super short announcement. Yeah, it was basically 2 sentences and saying like, okay, these are postponed. Important to know, this applies not only to the US but everyone. Yeah, so the regulation per se are postponed. It's not just about the US, but it's about the regulation per se that is postponed. Another thing that is postponed was a ban, actually, the only official ban that actually China has on exports against the US on gallium, germanium, and antimony and super hard materials. So I think that is quite substantial, yeah, because it shows China is also taking back some of the export controls that were actually installed before Trump went into office. So quite, as Martin also previously said, this is quite substantial, and it shows, I think, also China's eagerness to really come to a solution here. But there are, of course, also sticking open points that we will have to discuss, and these are the light red regulations here. And this includes, of course, the April export controls, which are not postponed, which are still in place. Yeah, and I think that is very important that these are still in place, because to be honest, with regards to magnets and NDFEB magnets, SMCO magnets, dysprosium, terbium, and so on, this is really the most problematic and most challenging export control, and it is still in place. Yeah, so I think that is very important to understand. So we are actually not. We are basically in terms of all the regulations, we are basically back to April. We are not back to before April. And I think that is important. So there has been discussion now about general licenses, as Martin also said, and facilitated, accelerated licensing. However, we do not know if that will actually be implemented, or will be implemented, but to what degree. And I think there we will have to wait for the next few months what will actually happen. There was in discussion certain general licenses, yeah, so that you would not have to get a license for every single export activity. However, these general licenses, I mean, they have been also in discussion for the European Union. Those are really hard to get because they come with a lot of strings attached, with very strict requirements for investigations, providing documentation, and so on. So the really critical question will be here for the next few weeks is how strict actually will China handle these general licenses? What we can expect, of course, is a certain facilitation of licensing for the normal licenses, for the normal dual use licenses. But again, I think I would be careful here to come to an early conclusion. And I think what we have been seeing also for the US-China relations is that you have sometimes very fragile agreements. And even as Martin said, it's a little bit more durable this time. You would still say, okay, there's a point of tension here. Yeah, and we will see how that will actually turn out. And again, I think it will also very much depend on the actual, political atmosphere and environment between China and the US, to what degree China will actually implement this or not. Yeah, so on the next slide, you see our nice tracker for all those control. This is only like a selection, but for these controlled materials, to see actually what is happening actually to export or not. Because I think we have to be very careful. Export control is not the same as an export ban. Yeah? So there's still the possibility to export. You all know that. So it really depends on the situation whether you get the materials or not. And there's anecdotal evidence, and we hear it a lot from our clients and others what the situation is. And there are some that say like, okay, we have no problem, we got it, and so on. There's others saying, okay, we are really short on these inputs. We are close to stopping production. Yeah, so there's this full range of anecdotal evidence that we see every day. But what you can also do is to actually look at these trade figures. And it's quite interesting because you see quite different patterns. So there are those materials where you see a very steep decline after the export controls went into place. And by the way, the curves actually show the development of export volumes since the announcement, the months since the announcement of the export controls. And you see, like for antimony, it's a crash near to zero. Yeah, so similar for lutetium, like one of the heavy rare earths. Same for bismuth or tellurium. So these are really where you say like, okay, it did never recover. Then you have some where you say like it's a V-shaped recovery, but it's not complete. So for example, for dysprosium, you're still at a lower level. Same for tungsten, for example, very important for oil drills, oil rigs, for example. So there you do not have like a complete recovery. And then there are others, like including, to be fair, rare earth magnets, at least at the moment, where you have well, quite good recovery, at least on average. Yeah, so not just saying everything is fine, because there are some like SMCO magnets and which are still hard to get, and also for some industries still difficulties. So and then you have well, a very those with a flat line. These are here artificial graphite and natural graphite, but to be fair, this is also due to the case that not all of these of the graphite has been controlled, especially those for the batteries. At least when it was installed in 2023, these were not part of it. And then you have like gallium and germanium, which you see like they have been a very long history, and actually saw a lot of increases and declines over history. And I think that is probably also something which we will see in the future for other materials, because you will see that depending on the political situation, you will see ups and downs. Okay, so then, and we will keep following these nice charts, and I think I'm very curious to see like how it will unfold in the next 2 to 3 months. What you do not see here is basically the breakdown by country, yeah, because there you also see very special situations. For example, for magnets, you saw a very small dip in the I think in September, and the dip was okay, so you could still say that's due to market forces, but it was extremely more for the US, yeah, and that was in the month before Xi and Trump met. So I think that is something to take account of, that also country level might look quite different. Okay, then to the next slide. What will come next? And that is the big question, of course. And we are not claiming here to really know, you know, all the details of what's coming. I think normally when a new export controls is coming, you sense it in the market, yeah, because especially when you talk to suppliers and so on, they really know this, yeah. So they really are aware, and so you get a little bit ahead of the curve or of the news. But I think there are certain candidates where you say like, okay, the likelihood is actually there. And I think one important thing to understand is, first of all, the export controls are here to stay. Yeah, so they will remain in place, even if like postponed by 1 year partly. They are now part of China's economic, like outward-looking economic policy. What we can also expect, it's an on and off tool. Yeah, so you can have licenses being tightened or you can relax it. And it really depends on the political situation. And that is, of course, also something which will hit or which will affect Europe. Yeah, because the overall relations will affect how much China will actually open the exports or not. It's a very precise tool in my eyes. Okay, then we can of course also expect better capacity, so that MAVCOM can actually grant those licenses which it wants to grant, but well, there are others of course that do not get the materials they need. And I think the Nexperia case also showed selecting single companies for export controls is still also an option. And this is a different system in a way, because it's not formal, yeah, it's implicit, it's not openly communicated, and I think that is very important to see that this can happen anytime. And it can happen also for very specific components, and maybe so specific that it doesn't even get to the news. Another question then is, which other materials could we expect? And I think and again, this is on the precondition that it gets worse. Yeah, so it's not saying it's coming in any case. But one magnesium is one candidate in my eyes because China is also having a very huge capacity here globally. The US is super reliant on Chinese magnesium. Magnesium is also an important material, especially for lightweight alloys and so on. So it's quite an important material. Then another issue which I found interesting, silicon carbide. I mean, it's maybe not so mainstream yet in chip manufacturing as a substrate, but in specific application it is. And we already had the case with gallium, yeah, so which is important to gallium arsenide and nitride applications. In silicon carbide, actually, we now have many important Chinese wafer producers and wafer suppliers. So I think it could be quite possible that they will go into a silicon carbide area. Then you have like abrasives for various industrial applications where China is also super dominant for aluminum oxides, but also silicon carbide abrasives. And then we have a group of products like lithium, cobalt, nickel, phosphates, which are super relevant for the battery supply chain. And I think here's a medium likelihood that they will do this because, obviously, China is reliant on lithium and cobalt and nickel imports. So you are, in a way, vulnerable yourself. So would you really do that? But then they could still say, like the refinery, the refined products like lithium hydroxides, we will limit that. Yeah, so possible, of course. Then we have other materials like zinc and copper. I think it's like copper being more of a bulk material, so it's a bit different. However, given the tense situation in the global copper market, I mean, that will still have some leverage. And let's not forget, before 2015, China actually had export taxes on many materials, like including zinc and tin, for example. Then, yeah, other rare earths could also be included, like neodymium and so on, which have much less impact since there's more availability outside of China. However, I would still say the impact on the market would still be quite impactful. And then I think that will be something to observe whether China will go more into the intermediate products. Yeah, so not just the raw materials, but something like magnets. And I think why was April actually so destructive in a way? Because it included the magnets. And that could also happen for other intermediates. As I said, like for the cathode active materials was already on the table. But look at the CCL, like copper clad laminates for PCBs, for printed circuit boards. We don't know. Yeah, so China is really having a cutting edge or like really having an advantage here, lots of production and so on. PCB, not a super complex technology, yeah, but you have to have the capacity. Yeah, so if from one day to the other, that happens, then yeah, that will actually be a problem. Okay, then to the next slide, and I hope to limit my time. Yeah, I mean that is actually something Martin could talk a lot about. We also did a recent study with other institutions for Progenerica, also showing okay, there's a lot of reliance on Chinese supply for pharmaceutical products, so all those ingredients and so on. So of course that is also a possibility. You never know. Yeah, it's not something that will happen today or tomorrow. But I think this dependency, of course, it's quite obvious also in other areas than raw materials. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so there was I just saw the question in the chat, are rare earths rare or not? I think we can talk about that afterwards, but let me just make the point here. We have to distinguish light and heavy rare earths. And for light rare earths, there's a lot of availability outside of China. We have like Australia, Linus, we have MP Materials in California. So there's a lot of availability. But when it comes to the heavy rare earths, including dysprosium and terbium, it's a totally different situation. And that is actually the bottleneck. And actually what we see now is a lot of diversification, as Martin has also shown in the US and beyond, to build like independent supply chains. And one is, of course, that MP Materials builds its own magnet production, yeah, of NdFeB and SMCO magnets, but also extracting and refining heavy rare earths. And this is quite remarkable because the Mountain Pass mine is a light rare earth mine, so it does not have much dysprosium and terbium in it. However, they're still trying it, and you see here basically the calculation on the left. I don't want to go into the details here, but we are basically trying to understand because they want to produce like 10,000 tons of rare earth magnets by I think by 2028. So will they be able to do that? And we calculated basically, okay, how much could the Mountain Pass mine actually deliver in terms of heavy rare earths? And it was like would be enough for 1,300 tons of magnets. So you still have a gap of 8,700 magnets, which will have to come from other mines, which there are some in Greenland and so on, but I think it's challenging. And it's also challenging because China has really a cutting edge and advantage in the technology for the separation of rare earths. So China has here like an innovation advantage, something that we totally will have to learn in the US, in Australia. So there's a bottleneck for heavy rare earths, and it's not something which will be solved in like a year. Okay, then to the next slide, and I think I'm almost over. Yeah, maybe you can skip this one, but I think it just shows there's a lot of dependency also in other supply chains, like for batteries, for LG, we see here, there's a lot of suppliers. It's not just the cathode materials, but also for others. Okay, I'm almost over. I think the final point that I would like to make, and I think it's not something to forget. Also, China is of course dependent and vulnerable, and I think we always have only this perspective of say like we are vulnerable, we have to diversify and so on. But actually, China also has this discourse of diversification, obviously, and it's doing similar things, but it also has similar vulnerability. And one example, in my view, is helium, where the US actually was, and helium is an important gas. I mean, you would say like it's so abundant, you can get it everywhere, but it's actually not the case because you like need for many applications ultra high pure gases like helium, especially in semiconductor manufacturing. And actually, in the past, like before 2022, China, the US was a main exporter of helium into China. Yeah, so there was a nearly complete reliance on the US. And then around 2020, there was a situation where they said like, okay, we really have to restructure our import sources. And then they switched a lot to Qatar and to Russia. And as you see now, like the US segment here in the pie chart is much less. So I think we have to keep in mind that there are also vulnerabilities. And for example, a discussion that has been on helium that is ongoing in China is that Qatar uses a lot of technology from the US to actually produce the helium destined for China. Yeah, so there's still a lot of dependency and vulnerability also. So that was a little bit of different perspective for the end. I would stop here and looking forward also to discuss and answer your questions.
Thank you, Martin and Jost, for the presentations. Let me take a look at the Q&A section and again invite the audience, please submit your questions if you have any. One came up. It's China seems to signal that they will punish companies or countries building up stock of a particular rare earth element. Will they succeed with this?
Yeah, there are two sides to the story, I would say. One is, of course, I mean, from what we hear, and I think you know that well, any export of rare earth element or other elements like gallium that is for the purpose of stockpiling will not be allowed, will not be licensed. So that makes it definitely more difficult. However, I mean, I think you have also to be aware you cannot control everything in the supply chain. So there will definitely be a situation where companies will, or where some actors will stockpile actually some of the materials. However, I don't think it will be enough. Yeah, so I think you can get some of it, but not really all of it. And I think one important thing to mention is the phenomenon of transshipment. So I think there will be cases where materials are transshipped, like exported into one country and then exported to another without knowledge of China. So I think in that cases, it's, I mean, we have seen that for, I think, for germanium and Belgium, for example. And by the way, that was, I think, also the reason why China wanted to expand it to like have these extra territorial controls. But there are also always these loopholes. And I think in the end, we also need to be aware that export controls, they have a they are only effective for a certain time. Just look at the US and Nvidia chips. 2 or 3 years ago, China was really angry. Okay, what has happened? It's really delaying our progress and so on. Nowadays, they are blocking Nvidia. I'm not saying they do not need Nvidia chips anymore. It's maybe also a very political decision. However, I think it shows that export controls are only effective for a certain time. And I think in the mining sector, it takes it takes quite some time to build up supply chains. So we are talking about a horizon of 5 to 10 years here. But successively, it will change. Yeah, and we hear about all these gallium, germanium projects in Kazakhstan and elsewhere, all the rare earth projects. Also need to be careful here because sometimes it's really like hot air and it takes time. But I think that's also something to keep in mind when we talk about the effectiveness of export controls.
Okay. There are questions coming in. Give me just a second. Companies have to provide a lot of sensitive information to China for receiving export licenses. What does China need this info for? Do we already see how they are using this information?
I mean, strictly speaking, there are also in China, there are rules that, of course, it's not allowed to give away any of the information to beyond like what Moscow can get and so on. So I also don't think that will happen. For me, it's in my view, it's a matter also of controlling the supply chain to learn how it works, to leverage a certain degree of influence, also to put high the threshold of getting a license. Yeah, because I think you really need to want it to get the license. Yeah, if you have to provide all that information. And let's be clear, I think it's not something that only China does. I mean, also for the European Commission, I think I remember these discussions about the anti-dumping investigation, anti-subsidy investigations on Chinese EV makers. I mean, there was also quite some, could say like, okay, maybe you need all that information for that, but there was also quite some investigation in that regard. So maybe that's also a new normal in a way, that we have to understand that governments are much more interested in what companies do than compared to before. How that will be used in the future, it's really hard to tell. I think that would be speculation, but I think what we can expect is that governments will require more information from companies in many regards. And that's also why I said it's nice to hear that the US will get more like general licenses and so on. But my immediate question was like, if it's the same from what we have seen in the EU and what was requested, then I'm not so optimistic that such general licenses will actually be issued on a large scale.
Yeah, just to add also to what Jost just said, and to answer the question, what does China need this info for? The official justification for putting export controls on these materials is that they are dual use in nature. So what the information ultimately is supposed to give China is proof that these materials will not be ending up in the defense industry of rival countries, right? But it will also lay bare quite in depth the supply chains of very vulnerable companies and give MOFCOM a very exact picture of where it can extract the maximum pain if it chooses to do so in a geopolitical scenario.
There was a question on helium. For which industries is China reliant on it?
Yeah, I think one important example that I personally know very well is for the semiconductor industry. So when you do like the manufacturing of wafers, you need lots of high purity gases, which include helium, but also other gases like argon, xenon, neon, a whole range. If you look at like a semiconductor facility and look at their suppliers or the gases that they get, you would be amazed and think like, okay, that's a whole set of chemistry that's used there. So I think helium for semiconductors is super important, and you have to keep also in mind, even if the helium supply and production is occurring in China or also the imports, there's a dominant position of international suppliers, yeah, like Air Liquide or Linde and Praxair. So I think that is also a concern for China from a Chinese perspective, so that they try to have like more domestic importers, because this supply of the helium to the semiconductor manufacturing facilities is quite a complex process. Yeah, and I think that is something where they're quite concerned. Yeah, it's maybe not the biggest vulnerability in semiconductors, as Martin has also shown the EDA part and other materials, but it's definitely one sector where China is, I think, getting increasingly better. But let's keep in mind that the chemical industry, the chemical supply to semiconductors, is a very decisive factor in the security of the supply chain, but also in terms of costs. Yeah, so because one reason, for example, why TSMC is so much more expensive in the US, in Arizona than compared to in Taiwan, is because they do not have the chemical supply chain in the same way as they have in Taiwan. But that's maybe another story. But I think, yeah, helium is definitely a very interesting yeah, element to talk about. No.
Coming back to the question asked in the chat you referred to earlier, Jost, you already answered the part of how rare are rare earth, I think. But there's, yeah, lots more actually in this question.
Okay, I have to read it quickly.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, yeah, are rare earths rare or not? No, they are not. I think in the end, it's about the concentration in the earth. So how much does it cost to get them out? It's true. I think the real bottleneck does not lie in the mines, except for heavy rare earths. I would still say like, okay, it's a bit different story. But I think the real bottleneck that policymakers and companies and supply chain managers need to focus on is obviously the refinery. That's absolutely true. And as like also obvious here in the question, China, as I also said, China has a strong innovation in separating the rare earths, because you have to keep in mind the rare earths, they have very similar chemical characteristics. And to separate those is super hard. And then you even need to get a very high purity. So that is something where China built experience over the last 30 years. And by the way, I remember there, or not I remember, but I read actually there was in the 1990s people saying already, okay, China has an advantage here, but we cannot learn from it because everything is in Chinese. Yeah. might be a different story today, but I think that shows that China was early on already very powerful here. In the 1990s. Nobody cared because it was even more a niche than it is today. But I think it shows like that China's cutting edge here is innovation. And by the way, they are also using this this innovation and technology in other countries, including Myanmar and Laos, for example, where they are also doing the in situ leaching, so the kind of pouring acids into the mountain and then getting the materials out of it, very polluting in a way. But I think that's also because they have a lot of experience with doing this from Jiangxi and like from central China. So yeah, it's definitely about not just about the resources and it being rare, but also about the technology.
Only 5 minutes left, so maybe 1 or 2 more questions. How many years will it take the West or the USA to reduce their dependency on China for rare earth? What's your estimate?
So an optimistic estimate, I would say 5 years, but maybe longer, like 10 years, because you have to keep in mind all the mining, all the shiny mining projects that are now coming up. You still have to prove that they are economically viable, and they will be more expensive than compared to Chinese mines. And the problem is now, just imagine China has this on and off strategy for export controls. Sometimes it closes the exports, sometimes it's opening it up. That's a very smart strategy because when you close it, you realize, okay, we are super dependent on China, we have to change something and all the projects are popping up and so on. Then you open the market again and all those projects that pop up are actually no longer economically viable anymore because everybody will again buy from China because it's so much cheaper. And I think that is something where I would say like, yeah, 5 to 10 years, but only if you really keep it up. We had the same discussion, and I think maybe some of you will remember, we had the same discussion, the exactly same discussion in 2011. And we had all these rare earth projects outside of China coming up. And then in 2015, China opened the gates again. And same situation. Yeah. So, and then, we went back to Chinese sources mainly, not all. I think Linus and MP Materials were the only that survived in a way. But I think it's very important and that's why I think the approach from the DoD, from the Department of Defense in the US is also the right one to say we have an offtake agreement with MP Materials. Because without that, they would not survive. They would not survive. And I think that is something that you really have to think about when building up the supply chain to say like, okay, for a certain period of time, we guarantee you a higher price at which we buy your materials. So 5 to 10 years. Yeah.
Just to add to what Jost also said, I think another lever that China also has is the technology. I mean, the refining technology, for example, in the raw material area, but also production technology in the pharmaceutical area, where we are already seeing that China is willing to also put export controls on those in order to prohibit the buildup of additional manufacturing capacities outside of China. So in India, just to go back to the pharmaceutical industry, which we had looked at, in India, they are building up generics production. They're quite a bit, and they have been complaining for quite some time now that they are not getting the technology that they needed in order to build up the capacity in India because China is not exporting those.
Yeah, I mean, since we still have 2 minutes, or is there another question? Otherwise, I would say like technology is definitely another area we have to look at for export controls. Yeah, so we have seen it, of course, for rare earths. I mean, there was like 2-3 years ago also this manufacturing equipment for solar. Let's keep in mind that also lots of photovoltaics, even if not in China produced, there's not much, but uses Chinese inverters and so on. So there's a certain reliance also on the Chinese technology. So just to keep that in mind. Yeah.
Thank you so much. for all these interesting questions and also again for the interesting input, Martin and Jost. Our time is up. So if you have any follow-up questions, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. Thank you once again for joining today's webinar. Have a great day or evening ahead and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.